When I was a little girl, my dad used to tell us bedtime stories, and he had some favourites that were our favourites, and he told them off by heart, and he embellished them, added little bits of detail, and we would have him up if he missed anything out, and it was very special. And we asked him for years and years, could you please write down the stories, the bedtime stories? They'd been my older brother and sisters, and then my younger brother and my stories. They'd been our children's stories, the grandchildren. And so one day he decided that he would put them down on paper. So I'm going to read you one of those stories today called Dean and Sarah Help the Fairies. When my dad was growing up, he lived next door to a fire station, and I think this is where that story idea came from. Dean and Sarah lived in a big rambling house next door to the fire station. Their father was the chief fire officer in the town, so of course the two children were interested in every fire that the brigade attended. A huge bell hung outside the fire station. Fire sirens had not been invented yet, and their father would ring this every time the alarm sounded to round up the other firemen. Some of the regular firemen even lived at the station. The other men had to be called from their homes. That was what the bell was for. It could be heard all over the town. There was a large spreading walnut tree at the back of the house, and Dean, who was 10, and his sister Sarah was 8, liked to climb up the tree when he wasn't at school and watch the big red engine drive out of the station, with the firemen in their helmets jumping on board to get to the fire as quickly as possible. One night, when Dean and Sarah were asleep in their beds, they awoke to hear the fire bell ringing next door, and they leapt out of bed. From their windows they couldn't see anything, so Dean went to his parents' bedroom, but Mr. Burton had already left the house. Dean heard the fire engine racing away into the night. Next morning at breakfast, Dean asked his father about the fire. "Oh, it was a large factory in Burnett Street," said Mr. Burton. "It was well ablaze when we got there, and we couldn't put it out." "Well, what do you mean?" asked Sarah. "Didn't you have enough water?" "No, nothing wrong with the water supply." No, it was very strange. It seemed that the more water we poured on the blaze, the more fiercely it burned. The flames should die down with gallons and gallons of water directed onto them, but this time they just flared up more fiercely. Mr. Burton frowned at the breakfast table as if it was the cause of the trouble. "I've never seen anything like it in all my years of firefighting," he said. The children had to go to school that morning, but the next day was a Saturday, and over breakfast Dean asked his father if he and Sarah could visit the site of the fire. They were always interested in the fires, their father thought. "Oh, well, there's nothing to see, just a huge grey area of grey ash," said Mr. Burton. "We had all our hoses going full out, but the building just burned to the ground. There's nothing still standing." Their father couldn't take them as he had a meeting to attend, and as their mother had no objections and said the ashes would have cooled well and truly by then, they walked together to the other side of town, to a street corner where the factory had made nuts and bolts and other hardware items for the past 6 years. It was just as their father had described, a huge concrete floor covered in grey ash. They walked the length of the site and then turned to walk back. "Gosh, I wonder why the water didn't kill the flames. It doesn't make sense," said Sarah. Deep in thought, Dean was kicking at a thick pile of ashes with his right foot. "Ow!" he cried out in pain as his shoe struck something hard and solid. "Oh, that hurt," he muttered, and he brushed the ashes aside to reveal a black iron ring. He pulled on it, and a trapdoor opened, revealing a steep flight of stairs going down, down, down into the bowels of the earth. "Come on, Sarah," said Dean. "We're going to explore this." Dean was a real doer. He pushed the trapdoor open as far as it would go and went down a few steps. Sarah joined him, and then she stood there, uncertain, She said, I'm scared, Dean. We don't know what's down there. But Dean said he was going down anyway. He reached up and closed the trapdoor. He went down step after step, and slowly she followed. There was just enough light coming from below to show the way. And what do you think they found as they reached the last of the steps? A riverbank of soft green moss with soft green grass with a narrow river flowing past, and on that river a man standing on a broad green leaf with a fishing rod in his hand. Looking hard at his sprightly form and features, Dean was quick to recognise an elf when he saw one. "Have you caught a fish yet?" he called out. "No," replied the elf, "but I don't mind, for it's peaceful here. I've had enough of the celebrations." "Celebrations? What sort of celebrations?" Sarah wanted to know. Casting his line into a fresh pool, the elf explained that all the fairy folk for miles around were assembled downriver on a riverbank much larger than this one, having a wonderful time singing and dancing, feasting and generally making merry. He suggested they go and see for themselves. He pushed a couple of leaves in their direction. "Don't worry, kids. They'll take your weight, being magic like everything else hereabouts." Dean and Sarah were not so sure, but they were both good swimmers, so could take a chance. They took the leaves that were offered and stepped on them. They didn't sink, and quickly they were carried downstream. 5 minutes later, they came to a bend in the river, and there on the opposite bank was the most astonishing sight. Sitting or standing on the green lawn was a gathering of elves, pixies, hobgoblins, wizards, gnomes, imps, fauns, and other fairy folk, singing and dancing, clapping their hands, and generally making merry. Under shady trees, spread with white tablecloths, were cakes of every kind, savouries, nuts, bowls of fruit, jellies, lemonade, chocolate. What a feast. The fairy folk spoke to Sarah and Dean. They seemed friendly. So when one elf called out, "Come and join us," the two children stepped ashore. Sarah was the first to speak. She asked, "What are you celebrating?" Pointing downstream, the elf replied, "You will have to ask the fairy princess." Dean and Sarah could hardly believe their eyes. Moving towards them along the grassy bank was the most beautiful creature they had ever seen. A young woman with golden hair down to her waist, sitting astride a large elephant with red and purple cushions piled about her. She stopped in front of the banquet tables, and several fairy folk hurried to help her get off the elephant, which she did very gracefully. As the other fairies led the huge animal away, the fairy princess invited the two children to come closer. Dean and Sarah approached somewhat shyly, and this is what the fairy princess told them. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful park above this spot. Trees and shrubs grew there, and scented plants and flowers of every description. Birds sang in the trees, and at night, when ordinary people had gone to bed, the fairy folk would leave fairyland for a while, climb the stairs and step out into the park to play amongst the trees. It was their park, insisted the fairy princess. "We loved it there," she said. "Of course we love fairyland too. It is our natural home. But the park was different smells and different sounds. It was a place we could escape to at the end of the day. And the birds were our friends, especially the tuis and the kararu." Then one day, heavy machines moved in, and men gave the order that destroyed the park. In its place, an ugly factory was built to make nuts and bolts and hinges and ugly things like that. The birds went then, because now there were no trees to nest in. No, we didn't start the fire, said the princess, knowing in her magic way that the children were going to ask this question. But when we knew that the factory was ablaze and firemen were arriving to put it out, we cast a magic spell on the whole area to make sure it burned even more fiercely. And we won. We won. Now there is no factory left. Dean and Sarah did not tell the princess that their father was the man trying to put out the fire. But at dinner that night, which they did not need, having shared in the fairies' banquet, they told Mr. Burton of their remarkable adventure. Mr. Burton listened with a serious look on his face. A few weeks later, Mr. Burton learned that the factory operators had decided not to rebuild, and he bought the land in Burnett Street, using all the money he had saved. He had the concrete flooring torn up, but he left the trapdoor in place. He had trucks deliver tons of soil, and he planted trees and shrubs, many of them with perfumed flowers, and he laid down many lawns and winding paths, and he created a garden of native trees. All this took several months. Dean and Sarah were delighted. The next year the shrubs and trees had grown taller. The following year they were taller still, and birds were beginning to come back. One night, some years later, Mr. and Mrs. Burton took their children to the new park quite late in the evening. They sat on the new seats by the flower beds and marvelled at the progress. It was close to midnight. It was a warm summer night, and the air carried the scent of thousands of flowers. A slight breeze rustled the trees. Birds were everywhere. Wood pigeons, tuis, even a moorpork could be heard in the darkness. Dean and Sarah moved through the trees excited, enjoying the atmosphere, and they heard above the rustling of leaves a distinct whispering that sounded like, "Thank you, thank you, thank you very much." And that's the end of my daddy's little story. This is a picture of my dad with my big brother and sister, who got to have these stories first. And this is a picture of all of my family, with my mum and my dad, who's the storyteller, my little brother, me, my sister, my mum, and my big brother. And guess who that is? That's Mrs. Bentley. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed a story with no pictures today. And if you didn't, maybe my brothers and sister might have liked it and their kids. I'll see you soon. Ka kite anō.